Hey, welcome back to Pop Culture Graveyard. I am Hollis. Today I'll be discussing Chelsea Girl, the 1967 debut album by Nico. Ladies and gentlemen, this is one of my favorite albums. Given the melancholy quality in Nico's voice, she sounds like every line she's singing is a life or death matter. And that's what you want from an artist. You want to feel like everything they're singing has affected them profoundly. Some people hate Nico's voice because she was partially deaf, so she veers a tad off key occasionally. But when I hear her voice, I'm almost crying discussing it. Singing these songs, it makes me cry. That is how emotionally stirring these performances are. So please join me for a deep dive into the brutal beauty of Chelsea Girl. Before we get going, I just want to thank my latest patron. Thank you, Charles. I really appreciate you hopping on board, and thank you for the support, Mr. Dibble. If you would like to help support the show and gain access to future uncut episodes of Pop Culture Graveyard, please consider joining my Patreon at patreon.com/popculturegraveyard. And thanks. Nico is mostly remembered today in tangential ways that do a real disservice to her creatively. She's either known as the singer, or chanteuse, that Andy Warhol forced the Velvet Underground into using in both their stage show, The Exploding Plastic Inevitable, and their debut album, The Velvet Underground and Nico, which I have to say is one of the few albums that I am obsessed with. Well, not really obsessed with, I like it a lot. Alright, fine, obsessed with. Or Nico is known for her short yet destructive romance with Jim Morrison, or for her time spent at the legendary Stooges Funhouse as the live-in girlfriend/mother figure of Iggy Pop. Even though history tries to paint Nico as nothing more than pop art arm candy, I feel she is criminally underrated as an artist. And this LP is proof of that. I see Nico as a damaged yet defiant creative force with an otherworldly voice who created magical music that vacillates wildly between acoustic balladry, avant-garde experimentation, baroque pop, and primal scream therapy. Chelsea Girl is a harrowing album that has a lot more in common with Neil Young's Tonight's the Night than it does The Velvet Underground and Nico. Though she had previously released one single, the Gordon Lightfoot song I'm Not Sayin', in 1965, and was featured on 3 songs on the Velvet Underground and Nico album. This was Nico's true coming out party as a solo artist. Chelsea Girl was recorded in the months directly after the Velvet Underground and Nico album was released, March of 1967, and this album was released in October of the same year. Chelsea Girl was produced by the Velvet Underground and Nico's brilliant producer, Tom Wilson. He is the man who we have to thank for Sunday Morning's inclusion on that album. This beautiful cover was done by Billy Name. Yes, the same Billy Name who did the second and third Velvet Underground covers. I think it's a gorgeous design that kind of captures the two sides of Nico, the warm and the ice cold. It may surprise you to know that Nico was not a fan of this album, but you should take that with a grain of salt. Nico was by nature a bit of a nihilist. We believe in nothing, Lebowski. Nico would have loved it if the musical backing on this LP was provided by bulldozers and backfiring cars. Nico was very uncomfortable with how pretty she was, and she was equally uncomfortable with how pretty this music is. In fact, there's a performance of the song Chelsea Girls off this album that takes place in the 70s that I will link to below, in which Nico sings the song in a room at the Chelsea Hotel, which is very meta, backed by a lone electric guitar. And it's very clear from Nico's expression that she is loving this abrasive version of the song. It can't hold a candle to the LP version, but it gives you an insight into her aesthetic tastes. As I stated, Nico was not a fan of this album. In particular, Nico despised the extensive flute playing. She was fine with the added strings, because everybody had strings on their album back then, from Love to the Beach Boys to the Beatles. But she hated the flute, so much so you would figure that Ron Burgundy is playing jazz flute all over this. He is not. Incidentally, for all of you vinyl heads, this is a 1977 Spanish pressing on Polydor, which is in near mint condition and sounds fantastic. And these are both wildly available and wildly affordable. Original copies of Chelsea Girl go for hundreds of dollars. And if you're like me, a hardcore collector on a hardcore budget, I highly recommend you seek out this pressing. Now let's hop into the individual album tracks. To see the rest of this week's episode, please join my Patreon at patreon.com/popculturegraveyard.